In my opinion, one of the most ridiculous storylines from the 2022 season was the rise of South Carolina football. Going into the 2022 season, Beamer Ball was getting so much hype. They had Oklahoma transfer quarterback Spencer Rattler, and they had been recruiting really well, so many expected them to put it all together. Some people were skeptical like me, and eventually, it looked like we were right. South Carolina got off to a really rough start, and it looked like all that Beamer Ball hype was going down the drain. Except, they put it all together and had a fantastic season. They ended up destroying Tennessee and ended their college football playoff hopes, and then went into Death Valley and beat Clemson. In any given year, if you beat a top 10 team and you beat Clemson, South Carolina fans are going to be pretty happy. While they did have some rough nights and some tough losses, South Carolina had a great season, and now many are wondering how are they going to do in 2023. They'll return Spencer Rattler once again, they bring back some of their top playmakers, and should have even more experience. In today's video, we're going to talk about 2023 South Carolina. We're going to go through the hype, talk about if the hype is actually legitimate, go through their schedule, talk about their key players, and I'll give my overall thoughts and prediction on them. But before we get started, quickly be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and let me know what team, topic, or player I could cover next. Now, let's go ahead and get started and talk about South Carolina. So going into the 2022 season, as I said, there was a lot of hype for Beamer Ball. In week 1, they weren't ranked, but they received a lot of votes. In week 1, they'd play against Georgia State, which they would win pretty easily. Week 2 was very interesting. They'd have to go on the road to play number 16 Arkansas, and in a duel between Spencer Rattler and KJ Jefferson, Arkansas got the better end. They ended up winning 44-30, giving South Carolina their first loss of the year. After that, they would return home to play against number 1 Georgia. In that game, South Carolina looked completely lost, and Spencer Rattler looked horrible. To be fair, most teams did against Georgia, but they lost 48-7, dropping to 1-2. Immediately, everyone said that South Carolina's hype was already over, that they were awful, and that the season was a wash. But after that, they'd have 2 gimme games against Charlotte and South Carolina State to get back to over 500. Then, they went on the road to number 13 Kentucky. In that game, they won 24-14, and while Kentucky ended up flaming out, it was a big win at the time and changed the momentum of the season. From there, Texas A&M came to Williams-Brice, and that game was a thriller. It seemed like they scored in 5 or 6 different ways, and special teams and defense was insane as they won 30-24, and now we're up to 5-2. This was a huge deal. South Carolina was ranked number 25 in the nation, and the hype for them was unreal. Missouri would come to town, who had been struggling recently, but unfortunately, Beamer's team showed significant growing pains as they lost 23-10 at home after being ranked for the first time in years. From there, they went on the road and beat Vanderbilt before they had to go to the Swamp. This was probably the worst game of the year for South Carolina, as there's an excuse to get blown out by Georgia, and they were at least competitive against Missouri, but Florida, that game was awful. They lost 38-6, and it's not like this year's Gators team was like the 2020 team. They were not good. This was a tough loss, but I'm sure every fan in the nation would take a loss like that in order to have the next 2 games that they had. The first one was number 5 Tennessee. The Volunteers were fresh off a loss to Georgia, but they were still hoping to get into the college football playoff because maybe a miracle could happen. Except South Carolina did not care. They ended up thrashing Tennessee 63-38. Hendon Hooker blew his knee out, and this was the most points an unranked team had ever put on a top 5 team in college football history. It was a ginormous win for him, but that was just the start. After that, they go on the road to play their arch rival number 8 Clemson, and in a crazy game, they ended up going into Death Valley and won. They won 31-30, shocking Clemson fans, shocking the college football world, and getting a ginormous win. Because of this, they'd climb back into the polls as they were ranked number 19 for their bowl game with Notre Dame. The Fighting Irish were ranked number 21 and also saw a little bit of a late season surge, and in a thrilling Gator Bowl, they ended up losing 45-38. So overall, South Carolina went 8-5 with a 4-4 mark in the SEC. They had 2 top 10 wins, and Spencer Rattler even broke the school record for most touchdowns in a single game. Things were pretty good for him. They lived up to the hype, and now there's a lot of hype for this year. But who do they return? So first, let's take a look at the quarterback spot. They're obviously going to bring back Spencer Rattler, who threw for 3,000 yards and 18 touchdowns last year. While he did struggle with interceptions and consistency, maybe this will be the year he puts it all together. I think he'll be a middle-of-the-pack quarterback in the SEC. Behind him, you have former big-time recruit Luke Doty, true freshman Lenora Sellers, and 2022 four-star Tanner Bailey. Overall, all in all, quarterback position is great for South Carolina. At running back, they're going to have to figure some things out. They lost Christian Beal-Smith and their top running back Marshawn Lloyd, so the guy who's going to step up is going to have to be Juju McDowell. I expect him to be the guy right away, and apparently Dakereon Joyner is going to play a little bit of running back, and then you'll have both Mario Anderson and freshman Dontavius Braswell. All in all, there is some potential there, but none of these names or players really stand out to me yet, and we're going to have to wait and see what happens. That could be the weakness. In terms of the wide receiver spot, I'm really excited for these guys. First and foremost, you bring back Antwane Wells. After transferring in from James Madison, Wells became one of the top receivers in college football last year, catching 68 passes for 928 yards and 6 touchdowns. They lost Josh Vann and I believe Jalen Brooks, but they'll return Xavier Legette, Amarion Brown, transfer Eddie Lewis, Omega Blake, and Peyton Mangrum. Dakereon Joyner will also be able to play a little bit of receiver, and then you have a couple of freshmen, including Nicholas Harbour, a 5-star, who they'll probably find a way to get the ball. Tight end, in my opinion, is pretty interesting. They ended up losing their superhuman tight end Jaheim Bell to Florida State, but they brought in 3 transfers. They grabbed Trey Knox from Arkansas, Nick Elksnis from Florida, I hope I said that right, and then Joshua Simon from Western Kentucky. Simon and Knox were 2 of the top tight end transfers in the nation, so overall, the offensive weapons are looking good. You have an experienced quarterback, you have a bona fide star in Antwane Wells, a couple of great supporting players, and some tight ends who can also grab some passes. We're really going to need Juju McDowell to step up, and that's partially going to be dependent on the offensive line. I'm not an expert on South Carolina's offensive line, but based off what I've read, it looks like they should be halfway decent, return some decent experience, and at minimum have some players with some potential. The offense for South Carolina should be fine. On the defensive side of the ball, I also don't have a lot of knowledge on who's going to be great and who's returning, but it looks like their 3 top defenders are going to be defensive lineman Tonka Hemingway, corner David Spalding, and outside linebacker Jordan Strachan. Either way, South Carolina typically has a pretty decent defense, and I like their defensive coordinator, so they should be fine. So, taking a look at their schedule, how will South Carolina do? Well, in week 1, they're going to figure it out and find out pretty quickly. They're going to travel to Charlotte, North Carolina, and play against the North Carolina Tar Heels. The Heels will return arguably the second best quarterback in the country in Drake May, and this game should be a thriller. It's the nationally televised game, and Rattler versus May is going to be must-see TV. This game, in my opinion, is going to go back and forth, but in my opinion, North Carolina is going to win. I think North Carolina has the better offense and the more experience here, and while I would not rule out South Carolina winning, I just think in week 1, North Carolina is going to be the better team, and at minimum, just get the win. I think it'll be close, but that'll put South Carolina at 0-1. In week 2, they'll come home and play against Furman, which should be over by halftime. They once again have to play Georgia in week 3. This game will be over and get ugly quick, as no one is seemingly at the level of Georgia, and now this game is on the road instead of at home. Right now, South Carolina is 1-2, just like last year. But will they be able to bounce back, or will they completely fall apart? We'll find out pretty quickly. They get Mississippi State at home, and with the Bulldogs returning one of the top quarterbacks in the country in Will Rogers, the offense will be tough to stop. I do think South Carolina has a really good chance in this one. I think it's a 50-50 game. Mississippi State is a new coach, and they're not exactly a juggernaut, so I'm going to say South Carolina wins this and gets to 2-2. After that, they'll travel on the road to Tennessee, and this game, in my opinion, is going to get ugly. Tennessee has not forgotten what happened last year, and they're surely going to want to avenge last year's loss. Now this game is in Neyland, and I think Tennessee wins by 3 or 4 touchdowns. I could be dead wrong, but that's just what I initially think. After that, Florida's going to come to town, and this is a huge game for them. Right now, the team is 2-3, and this will be the deciding game for the rest of the year. In my eyes, I think South Carolina is going to win, as in my opinion, they're not going to forget last year's game, which was their worst performance of the 2022 season, and I just don't think Florida's that good this year, and until the Gators prove something, I think South Carolina deserves the benefit of the doubt, and they'll get to 3-3. After that, things get a little bit difficult for me in terms of picks. They go on the road to Missouri, and in my previous videos and in my previous predictions, I already picked the Tigers to win that game. I believe that is a 50-50 matchup, and for some reason, Mizzou has caused South Carolina fits over the last few years. With this game being on the road against Mizzou, I think South Carolina is going to end up losing, putting them at 3-4. After that, they're going to go on the road to Texas A&M. That game is not much easier, as it is not easy to play at Kyle Field, and I actually think A&M's going to be pretty good this year, so I think that is another loss. These road matchups are just very difficult for them. That'd put them at 3-5 at this point in the season, and they would need to win 3 of 4 in order to make a bowl game. The first win will come at home against Jacksonville State, which is now FBS, but that game will not be close. After that, they'll get Vanderbilt at home, and while Vandy is improving under Clark Lee, I think South Carolina wins this game, and this will get them to 5-5. This is going to be a crucial time in the season, as they're going to have 2 huge home games. The first one comes against Kentucky. I don't really know what to think of Kentucky right now. They have a lot of good transfers, they have a productive quarterback in Devin Leary, and Stoops has been consistent, but at the same time, it is a lot of transfers, and Kentucky flamed out last year too. In my opinion, I think South Carolina is going to continue the momentum, win their 3rd straight game, and get to 6-5. Unfortunately, it won't do much, as I think Clemson will beat them pretty badly, despite the game being at home, as the Tigers won't forget what happened to them last year, and I think Clemson's going to take the next step this season and get back to where they typically are, and this puts South Carolina at 6-6 in the regular season with an opportunity to go to a bowl game again. That will be pretty good for Beamer Bowl, and while some will say it was a disappointing year, I think 6-6 or 7-5 is right on par for them. They have a ridiculously difficult schedule. North Carolina will likely be a top 10 to top 15 team, Georgia will be a top 5 team, Tennessee will be a top 10 to 15 team when they play, and all 3 of those games come pretty early on in the year. Also, going on the road against Missouri and A&M won't be easy, as they have not been able to beat the Tigers, and A&M should be better, and then you also play Clemson, who should be a top 5 team. So just all in all, it's a really tough schedule for South Carolina, and I know that's how it goes in the SEC, but I don't see the same season as last year. I mean, no one predicted them to beat Tennessee or Clemson, and if it weren't for those wins, they would have gone 6-6 last year. So I basically just project the same thing as last year, except they don't get those 2 monumental wins. But Beamer Bowl always seems to prove me wrong, so they'll probably snatch some sort of upset or win more games than I predict. But what do you guys think? If you're a South Carolina fan, what did I get right and wrong? What is your take and opinion on this year's team? And what team should I cover next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and check out both my Tennessee and Mizzou preview. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.